Amara was born on a stormy night, the kind when the winds howl through the trees and the rain drums against the roofs like urgent messengers. From her earliest days she had no family name, no one to claim her bloodline or shield her from the scrutiny of the elders in the village of Leone. She lived at the edge of the settlement in a small hut built from reeds and clay, a place where the river whispered secrets to the trees and the wind carried tales from faraway lands. Despite her humble circumstances, Amara's presence radiated warmth and curiosity. Her eyes, wide and bright, seemed always to hold a question or a wonder, and her smile could light the darkest corner of the village courtyard. Children gravitated toward her immediately. They would gather beneath the shade of the ancient baobab tree where she lived, enthralled by her stories. Amara had a gift for spinning tales so vivid and alive that the children could almost hear the rustle of wings, feel the brush of fur against their hands, and smell the earth of distant lands she described. She did not simply tell stories, she made them dance around her audience and in doing so, taught lessons of kindness, cleverness, and courage. She would instruct them in games that required cooperation and imagination, where the weak and small could triumph through wit rather than strength, and every child, regardless of their background, felt they belonged. Even though the children loved her, the elders watched Amara with unease. They whispered behind their hands and shook their heads whenever she passed. She was clever, that much was clear, and cleverness in a girl without a family name was dangerous in their eyes. They feared that her stories might change the hearts and minds of the young, that she could teach them ideas the elders themselves were unprepared to control. A girl who could influence the children so completely might one day challenge the rigid customs that had governed Leone for generations. And without a family name to anchor her, without the protection of ancestry or lineage, she was fully exposed, a wild spirit untethered by tradition, whose cleverness and charm could sway the village in ways the elders could not predict or contain. Despite this, Amara remained gentle and unassuming. She carried no malice, no intent to disrupt the order that the elders clung to. She performed her daily tasks quietly and diligently. She helped fetch water from the river for the sick, she gathered herbs and roots for those too weak to venture into the forest, and she offered her voice in laughter and song to anyone who needed it. Villagers often remarked that her laughter was contagious, that even the hardest of hearts softened when they heard it. The children adored her not only for the stories and games but for the simple ways she found to make life brighter. She understood the small joys that sustained a community, and she knew how to magnify them. Yet, her lack of a family name constantly reminded the villagers and the elders alike that she was an outsider. In the eyes of the council, in the records of the village, she had no rightful place. She existed in the spaces between tradition and fear, a reminder that life could exist without the rigid definitions that had governed Leone for centuries. Her mere presence became a test of the village's capacity for empathy, for acceptance, and for understanding that true worth was not always tied to lineage or title. Even the animals seemed to sense her purity and intelligence. Birds would perch near her shoulder as she spoke, and the younger goats and sheep would follow her as she walked through the hills, trusting her instinctively. Amara's cleverness showed in how she could solve small disputes between children, teaching them patience and compromise, and how she could find hidden paths through the forest that made journeys faster and safer. Every act she performed, no matter how small, reflected her heart, a heart unbound by fear, rich with curiosity and guided by kindness. But while the children and animals embraced her fully, the elders saw a threat in her very existence. A girl without a name, yet full of influence, cleverness and compassion, was not merely a child, she was a force the village had not anticipated. And so, even as Amara laughed and played, even as she sang and tended to the weak and the young, shadows of suspicion began to gather, whispering that the one who had no name could not be trusted, and that her cleverness might one day undo the careful order the elders had built. Amara, unaware of the undercurrents of fear swirling around her, continued to live with gentle courage. She did not rebel, she did not provoke, she simply was herself, kind, clever, and alive in a way that the village had never seen. Every day she reminded the children that a heart full of love and a mind sharp with curiosity could shine brighter than any name, any title, or any lineage. Yet, in the hearts of the elders, the seeds of doubt and fear were already being planted, and her journey, as bright and innocent as it seemed, was about to meet the weight of their suspicion and the power of tradition. The village of Leone had always been governed by caution, tradition, and the weight of unseen forces that villagers claimed shaped their fates. To the council of elders, Amara's cleverness and the energy that radiated from her daily life were no longer just charming quirks of a bright child. They became signs of something dangerous, something that might disrupt the fragile balance of the community. Every twist in her stories, every imaginative game, Every clever solution to a minor dispute was scrutinized through a lens of fear. Her curiosity, once admired, began to seem like a deliberate probing into forbidden knowledge, a challenge to customs that had stood for generations. Rumors began to circulate with the subtlety of mist seeping through the village streets. Mothers whispered in hushed tones as they passed her hut, claiming that their children had spoken of seeing strange lights around Amara when she laughed. Fathers muttered that crops that failed or sudden illnesses might be linked to her presence, and the elders nodded gravely, reinforcing each other's suspicions. Soon, these rumors swelled into an almost tangible atmosphere of fear, wrapping around the village like a heavy fog. People began to suggest that her cleverness was unnatural, that her knowledge of the forest, the river, and the hidden paths of the land came from forces that no mortal should command. Superstition guided every decision of the council. They recalled old stories, tales of witches and spirits that had brought famine and misfortune upon villages in distant lands, and they began to see parallels where none existed. To them, Amara's laughter and bright eyes were no longer innocent, they were omens. When a sudden storm swept the village one afternoon, washing away part of the riverbank, elders whispered that it was her doing, that the wind and rain answered to her presence. Even when the river flowed calmly, they would claim that it carried her hidden intentions, a silent confirmation of the evil they feared might lurk beneath her clever mind. Parents, swayed by these tales, began to act cautiously around Amara. Children were pulled away from her side during play, warned not to mimic her clever tricks or repeat the fantastical stories she told. Amara, who had once been surrounded by laughter and eager faces, found herself increasingly alone. The games beneath the baobab tree were abandoned, and the songs that once rang through the edges of the village became faint echoes. Even those children who remained loyal to her began to look over their shoulders nervously, wary of the judgment that might fall upon them for spending too much time in her company. Amara noticed the change with a quiet sadness. She did not understand why the laughter had stopped, why friends no longer came to the river to share stories or fetch water together. The animals, too, seemed to sense the shift in human behavior. Birds perched less often near her shoulder, and the goats followed her more hesitantly. Still, she carried on with her gentle routines, helping fetch water, sharing small remedies from the forest, and humming songs that only she seemed to remember. Her spirit remained unbroken, yet she could feel the cold shadow of isolation creeping into her life. The elders convened, convinced that a decisive action was necessary to protect the village from what they now called the unseen influence of the nameless girl. They discussed ways to curb her cleverness, ways to ensure she no longer shaped the minds of the young or worse, drew the attention of the spirits they believed watched over Leone. Each meeting reinforced the growing narrative that Amara was not just different, but dangerous. A wild force unbound by family, uncontained by tradition, and unchecked by authority. Even in this growing fear, some villagers hesitated. They remembered the small acts of kindness she had performed, the laughter she had brought to sick children, the guidance she had offered lost travelers along the forest paths. Yet these memories were fragile against the tides of superstition, and slowly, one by one, even these villagers turned wary glances toward her. The fear had become collective, a shared conviction that the girl without a name, whose curiosity and cleverness had once been celebrated, was now an omen, a danger that the village could not afford to ignore. Amara felt the isolation keenly, yet she did not complain or rebel. Her heart remained open, though her circle of friends dwindled and her songs, once welcomed by all, now echoed faintly against empty spaces. The village's fear had begun to shape her reality, and though she continued to walk among the elders and children with gentle courage, the whispers of suspicion clung to her as closely as the morning mist along the river. Her life, once full of warmth and laughter, had become a delicate dance between kindness and the watchful eyes of those who no longer understood her heart. And with that, the villagers, gripped by fear and superstition, carried out the sentence. Amara was buried, the soil covering her slender form, her cries muffled beneath the weight of earth and silence. No name was spoken, no songs were sung, no ceremony performed. Only the wind seemed to linger, whispering through the trees and over the river, carrying faint echoes of the girl who had once danced and laughed so freely. And somewhere deep within, the seeds of a truth that could not be buried had begun to stir. The hill outside Leone rose gently from the surrounding fields, its grass swaying in the morning breeze like a silent witness to countless seasons. That day, it bore a burden unlike any before, the body of Amara, the nameless girl, whose life had been claimed not by illness or age, but by the weight of fear and superstition. Villagers escorted her in solemn procession, their faces pale with apprehension. No songs accompanied the march, No prayers were offered and no names were spoken, only the rhythmic crunch of feet against the earth and the occasional whisper of the wind through the trees. The grave itself was shallow, dug hastily with wooden spades and crude hands. The earth, though fertile and dark, seemed to resist being disturbed, and the villagers worked with a sense of unease pressing upon their shoulders. Each clod of soil that fell over Amara's form seemed heavier than it should have been, as if the ground itself mourned the injustice being committed upon it. Yet fear demanded efficiency. They completed the burial with swift motions, covering her completely without marker, stone, or even a simple branch to signify her resting place. She was to vanish from memory, a nameless figure erased from both earth and sky. As the villagers departed, leaving the hill empty and quiet, a subtle disturbance began to ripple through the surroundings. The wind, gentle moments before, shifted and carried soft murmurs across the fields, murmurs that sounded almost like words, though no lips moved to form them. The trees seemed to bend closer, their leaves trembling as though straining to hear something they had never been meant to hear. Birds perched on branches fell silent, heads cocked, listening. Even the river in the valley below seemed to pause in its flow, a low murmur of water almost harmonizing with the whispers in the air. Elders who lingered behind, feigning a final inspection of the hill, were the first to notice the unusual signs. Tiny flickers of light, like floating embers, appeared around the burial site, moving with a rhythm that seemed almost deliberate. The animals in the vicinity, goats, birds, and even the timid forest creatures that sometimes wandered close to the village, behaved peculiarly. They paused at the hill's edge, ears alert, eyes fixed on the patch of earth where Amara lay. Some approached cautiously, sniffing and circling, as if sensing a presence too profound to comprehend. The elders whispered to each other, their voices tight with apprehension. "The spirits, they are restless," one murmured, glancing nervously at the trembling lights. Another added, "It is as if the earth itself refuses to hold her. Even the wind carries her cries." They spoke in hushed tones, aware that the villagers had left and that no one else would hear their words, yet the urgency in their voices betrayed a growing fear that something beyond their understanding was awakening. Despite the absence of ceremony, despite the intention to erase her entirely, Amara's presence seemed to persist in subtle ways. The soil above her heart pulsed faintly, almost imperceptibly, as if echoing the rhythm of her life. The whispers of wind carried fragments of her laughter, her songs, and her gentle words. Even in death, she seemed connected to the world around her, to the river, to the trees, and to the children who had once loved her. By the time the sun reached its zenith, the villagers had returned to their homes, thinking the matter concluded. Yet the hill remained charged with an energy that defied explanation. The soft cries and flickering lights continued, a quiet protest of a soul unjustly taken, and a promise that her story, though buried, would not remain silent. The elders, uneasy and silent themselves, knew that this burial was unlike any other, that something extraordinary had begun, and that the nameless girl's presence would not be so easily forgotten. As darkness fell over Leone, the village slept under a sky blanketed with stars, unaware of the events unfolding just beyond the hills. The grave where Amara lay, shallow and unmarked, seemed still at first, but soon a gentle stirring arose from the earth itself. Tiny pulses of light emerged, dancing like fireflies across the soil, and a soft hum began to vibrate through the surrounding air. It was a sound at once ancient and comforting, carrying a rhythm that seemed tied to the heartbeat of the land. From the realm beyond, the ancestors of Leone began to gather, their spirits rising from the river, the trees, and the hills, converging around the grave of the nameless girl. They appeared as luminous figures, ethereal and imposing yet suffused with warmth, their faces serene with wisdom earned over countless generations. Though unseen by the mortal eyes of the villagers, their presence filled the night with a sacred gravity, and the whispers of their arrival rustled through the leaves, stirring animals and birds into hushed attention. The ancestors encircled Amara's resting place, bending toward her with reverence. Though she could not see them with her mortal eyes, she felt their presence deep within her spirit, a soothing warmth that chased away the fear and despair that had gripped her moments before. The energy of their gathering seeped into the soil, surrounding her body with a protective embrace that defied the intent of those who had buried her in silence. Through their whispers, the ancestors spoke directly to her soul. Their voices were layered, overlapping like a river of sound, gentle yet insistent. "You are known, child of light," they said. "Your story will not end buried. Your name will be spoken by those yet to come. The children of this village will hear it, and through them, your spirit will endure." The words filled her being with a renewed sense of purpose and a calm resolve. She understood that her life, though taken too soon, was not meaningless. She had a legacy that the living could not erase. The ancestors then turned their attention outward, projecting her name into the winds that wove through the village, into the trees, and along the flowing river. The syllables of her true identity, Amara, drifted invisibly but unmistakably, carried with an insistence that no human could block. The sound was subtle, more like a whisper than a voice, but it reached the hearts of children asleep in their homes. In their dreams, they felt the pull of a presence both gentle and strong, as if the wind itself was teaching them a song, a secret meant only for the pure of heart. Some children stirred in their sleep, murmuring her name aloud, the first sparks of remembrance kindling in the next generation. Animals close to the grave moved with unusual attentiveness, sensing a harmony between the living world and the spirit realm. Even the river, flowing quietly beneath the moonlight, seemed to hum in resonance, echoing the whispers of the ancestors and carrying them farther than any eye or ear could perceive. As the night deepened, the ancestors lingered, ensuring that Amara's essence would not fade. Their presence remained protective and nurturing, infusing the earth around her with sacred energy. Though buried without name or ceremony, Amara was surrounded by a legacy far greater than mortal law or fear could contain. In this convergence of earth, spirit, and wind, she learned that her story, her name, and her truth were indelibly etched into the very life of Leone, a truth the village would one day remember, whispered to every child who could hear the secrets carried by the ancestors. You said. In the days following that sacred night, a subtle change began to ripple through the village of Leone. The air seemed lighter, carrying a faint melody that no adult could name, yet which the children instinctively felt. During their games in the fields and along the riverbanks, a soft whisper would slip into their voices, barely audible but persistent. Amara. Amara. The name moved through their laughter like a hidden rhythm, threading itself into songs, rhymes, and playful chants. It started with the youngest children, who often spoke aloud the things they did not fully understand. While chasing each other through tall grass or tossing pebbles into the river, one would utter her name and soon others repeated it, their voices merging in an unplanned chorus. Amara runs faster than the wind, one would exclaim. Amara finds the hidden berries first, another would say. The name became a secret code of cleverness and agility, an invisible thread connecting the children to someone they had never met but somehow knew. As more children joined in, their whispers grew bolder, transforming into songs sung while washing clothes at the river or skipping along dusty paths. Even though they did not know the full story of her burial or the cruelty that had silenced her, they felt her presence in their play, as though Amara herself were guiding them. A quiet courage began to manifest in their actions. They helped one another without expecting reward, shared their snacks, and found clever solutions to everyday problems. The kindness and ingenuity that Amara had embodied began to spread through the youngest hearts of the village like a soft, unseen wind. Parents and elders noticed the children behaving differently, though they could not understand why. A child who was once timid would now offer help to friends struggling with chores, or share a clever trick for crossing the river safely. It is as if the children are listening to someone, an elder murmured, rubbing his chin thoughtfully. Others shrugged, attributing it to imagination, youth, or even divine favor. None suspected that a nameless girl, buried just beyond the village, had begun to influence their children through whispers carried by the wind and the watchful spirits of the ancestors. By midweek, the name Amara was no longer confined to private play. During gatherings, games, and impromptu storytelling sessions, children began including her as a central figure. One boy recounted how Amara had outwitted a mischievous monkey near the river. A girl mimicked Amara's clever ways of solving disputes over shared toys. With each retelling, the name became more familiar, more alive, carrying the essence of her personality, cleverness, kindness, and courage, into every corner of the village. Even the animals seemed to recognize the change. Goats and chickens that roamed freely near the river paused as if listening when the children chanted her name. Dogs wagged their tails as if they understood the significance of the whispered syllables. Birds perched in the trees above trilled in response, harmonizing in subtle ways with the children's songs. Nature itself appeared to acknowledge that Amara's spirit, though silenced in life, now flourished through those who were innocent enough to hear her. By the end of the week, it was clear that a quiet revolution had begun. Though she had been buried without name, Amara's essence lived on through the next generation. Her kindness and cleverness were no longer hidden, they were being learned and carried forward. The children of Leone, guided unknowingly by whispers of her true name, were beginning to embody the virtues she had always represented, ensuring that the spirit of the nameless girl would never truly be forgotten. After the whispers of her name began circulating among the children, the village of Leone experienced a subtler, yet more profound transformation. Nature itself seemed to bend toward Amara's presence, as if the land recognized the injustice done to her and sought to honor the life and spirit that had been silenced. The hills and rivers, the trees and animals, all became silent witnesses and allies in her posthumous awakening. The first signs appeared near her burial site. Where the soil had been disturbed to erase her existence, new growth emerged almost immediately. Tiny wildflowers, delicate and luminous, sprouted from the exact spot where she had been laid to rest, their petals glinting like morning dew in the sun. The colors were unusual, a blend of soft golds and gentle blues that seemed to shimmer when the wind passed over them. Villagers passing by paused instinctively, sensing something extraordinary in the blossoms. They had been told the land was fertile, but nothing in living memory had bloomed with such brilliance on that hill. Even the elders, who knew the soil intimately, were startled and whispered among themselves that it was a sign, a mark that something sacred lingered beneath the earth. Streams near the burial site also began to behave strangely. Small rivulets that had once trickled lazily toward the river shifted their courses subtly, converging near the hill where Amara lay. The water, clear and cold, carried with it the faintest murmurs, like the softest echoes of a song. The villagers noted that if one bent close to the flowing water and listened carefully, it seemed to carry words, fragments of a melody that resonated with compassion, cleverness, and joy. Fishermen, who spent hours along the banks, swore they had seen ripples form patterns resembling the shape of a small laughing girl, as though the water itself remembered her form. Birds became another instrument of her enduring presence. At dawn and dusk, they would gather near the hill and begin to sing in unusual patterns, their chirps and calls weaving together in harmonies that mimicked human speech. Some children claimed they could hear the syllables of her name, Amara, embedded in the songs of the birds. They would run through the village telling friends and siblings to listen closely, and adults, though skeptical at first, began pausing during their daily chores, amazed to hear what seemed like deliberate communication from the natural world. Even hunters in the nearby forests remarked on the odd patterns of birdsong that accompanied their journeys, guiding them safely through the trees and across streams, as if the spirits were leading them. The wind, too, carried her essence. Gentle breezes that moved over the village were tinged with subtle fragrances, a combination of wildflowers, river water, and the faintest trace of incense, and sometimes, the villagers swore they could hear soft sighs riding the currents. These whispers were not words, not in the way humans understood, but they brought a comforting presence, a sense that Amara's spirit watched over the land. The winds moved in unpredictable paths, curling around corners, rising through valleys, and even interrupting daily routines with sudden gusts that seemed to demand attention. Some claimed that when the wind passed over the burial hill, it carried the faint sensation of laughter, as if Amara were playing in the air, invisible yet joyfully alive. Animals became further testament to her enduring presence. Goats, sheep, and even forest creatures approached the burial hill with unusual boldness. Deer grazed near the wildflowers that had grown above her grave, unafraid of human presence, while birds nested in trees directly above the site, their feathers brushing against the earth with care. Even domestic animals seemed to sense her essence, moving closer to the hill, rubbing against the soil, or pausing mid-step to look toward it as though recognizing a guardian presence. Farmers and shepherds began leaving small offerings, seeds, water, and food, at the hill's edge, believing these gestures honored the spirit that now permeated their land. As these signs multiplied, the villagers could no longer dismiss them as coincidence. Crops planted near the hill grew faster and stronger than elsewhere, nourished perhaps by the unseen energy Amara exuded. Streams that diverted closer to the hill irrigated the surrounding fields naturally, ensuring harvests flourished even in dry seasons. Flowers continued to bloom in unusual abundance, spreading their seeds along paths where people and animals walked. The children, ever attuned to the spiritual heartbeat of their surroundings, would run ahead of adults, pointing to a cluster of petals or the playful movement of birds and whisper, "Amara is here." Elders who once feared and rejected her now began to speak cautiously of her power and presence. They watched how the land responded to her, realizing that she had not been a threat, as superstition had suggested, but a force of balance and harmony. Meetings held in the village square slowly incorporated her story, though in hushed tones at first. "Even nameless," the elders murmured, "she leaves her mark on the earth and sky." Over time the narrative grew, a girl unjustly buried yet impossible to erase, whose essence reminded all who lived there that life, kindness, and cleverness cannot be silenced, not even by death. By the end of the season, the villagers understood that Amara's spirit was woven into the very fabric of the land. The hill, streams, animals, winds, and birds were her living testament. Her presence nurtured the village silently, shaping not only the physical environment but also the hearts of those who lived there. Children laughed with her whispers in their ears, farmers tended the fields blessed by unseen hands, and even the adults, once blind to her worth, began to see that Amara's essence permeated every facet of their lives. It became clear, though she had been buried without a name, Amara had claimed a place in the world that no human decree could erase. Nature itself bore witness to her life and her spirit, and through every flower, stream, bird, and breeze, the village of Leone learned that true presence transcends mortality, and that even without recognition, the essence of a pure heart could permeate the land, shaping its rhythm and song forever. As the weeks passed, the elders of Leone began to notice a pattern they could no longer ignore. While daily life continued with its usual rhythm of chores, market visits, and tending to livestock, there were moments when the past seemed to seep into the present. In the early mornings when the mist still clung to the fields, the faint, melodic whispers of a name, Amara, drifted across the village. At first, many dismissed it as the fanciful imagination of children, whose games often echoed laughter and invented stories. Yet, the frequency and consistency of these utterances soon made it impossible to write off as coincidence. It began subtly. A child skipping along the riverbank would suddenly stop and call out, "Amara!" Another, playing near the granary, would recite a clever solution to a small problem, attributing it to Amara as if seeking her guidance. The sound of the name spread like a gentle wind through the village, carried from one child to another, whispered in games, songs, and innocent chatter. Adults, initially skeptical, started noticing that these moments seemed too purposeful to be random. Patterns emerged. Particular phrases, melodies, and gestures accompanied the repeated calling of her name. Farmers tending their fields were among the first adults to pay attention. While plowing or sowing seeds, they would hear the children's chants echoing faintly across the hills, and with it came an inexplicable sense of clarity and resolve. They observed that fields near where Amara had been buried flourished with unusual vigor, crops growing taller and greener, their leaves shimmering with an almost magical brightness. Streams flowing through the village seemed to carry the whispers farther, bending slightly around fields and gardens as though guiding the water toward life and abundance. As more villagers observed these phenomena, they began to speak of them among themselves. An elder who had once dismissed the children's voices as childish chatter now shared his experience with other council members. "I have heard the name. Not once, not twice, but countless times. And with it comes guidance, a sense of balance I cannot explain." Others nodded quietly, some with unease, some with awe, recognizing that what they had feared in life might now be manifesting in ways they could not fully control. The children continued to be the primary conduits of Amara's memory. In their songs she was a clever problem solver. In their games she was a guide and protector. They did not fully understand why she had been silenced, why the adults had buried her without a name, but their hearts responded to her presence as though instinctively aware of her innocence and the injustice done. Through their playful recitations, the story of Amara began to embed itself into the village's oral history, carried forward not by written records but by living memory. Nature seemed to participate in this reclamation of memory as well. Birds would perch nearby during the children's play, echoing syllables that resembled Amara's name. Breezes would pick up her whispers and carry them down the valley, bending the tall grass in a soft, flowing rhythm. Even the smallest creatures seemed attuned to the unfolding story. Goats, chickens, and domestic dogs lingered near the children as if listening intently, reinforcing the connection between Amara's spirit and the living world around her. Gradually, the elders began to accept the undeniable truth. The children were vessels for the ancestors' intent. Amara's name had been given back to the world, not by human decree, but by those who watched over the village from beyond, spirits who ensured that justice, however delayed, would be remembered. The elders convened meetings where they spoke carefully about what had happened, acknowledging the harm done and encouraging the younger generation to carry the story forward. These discussions were quiet and deliberate, a recognition that though the village had tried to erase her, the ancestors had safeguarded her memory through the pure hearts of children. With each passing day the pattern became clearer. Festivals and gatherings began incorporating her name into songs and dances. Tales of her cleverness, kindness, and courage were retold, not in secret but openly, so that all might remember the nameless girl who had been silenced. The village slowly transformed its perception, understanding that Amara's presence, though once ignored, was now an enduring guide. She had transcended the injustice inflicted upon her, leaving her essence to nurture, instruct, and inspire. By acknowledging her existence and the injustice she had suffered, the village began to heal. Children and elders alike carried her story, whispering her name with reverence. Through repeated songs, games, and signs in nature, Amara's memory became inseparable from the land itself. Her story, once buried in silence, now resonated through every corner of Leone, ensuring that the nameless girl would never again be forgotten, and that her essence would continue to guide and protect generations to come. The story of Amara, once a nameless girl buried unjustly by the village of Leone, gradually transformed from whispered legend into a living, vibrant legacy. As children repeated her name in games and songs, elders and parents began to recognize the profound truth in what had been happening. Amara's courage, kindness, and cleverness, once ignored or feared, became central to the moral fabric of the village. Parents took care to teach their children not only her name but the lessons her life, and her death, had imparted. They emphasized honesty, bravery, and compassion, qualities that Amara had embodied naturally, even in the face of fear and rejection. Small ceremonies emerged, first among the elders who had once condemned her, and soon involving entire families. They planted trees near her burial hill, each sapling representing a quality of Amara's spirit: the resilience of the oak, the grace of the willow, the gentle strength of the almond tree. During these gatherings, the children would recite her name aloud, feeling the pulse of her memory through the land, through the rustling leaves, and through the whispering wind. The adults, initially hesitant, came to recognize the comfort and guidance these rituals offered. They spoke of Amara's virtues not as a moral lesson imposed from above, but as a reflection of what they had witnessed in the natural signs around the village: the flourishing flowers, the shifting streams, the bird songs that seemed to echo her name. The elders, guided by the whispers of the ancestors, formalized these commemorations. They instructed families to leave offerings by the trees and near the river, simple gestures such as water, seeds, or small tokens, acknowledging the invisible presence that had nurtured and protected them despite being wronged. Over time, these offerings became communal events, coinciding with the cycles of planting and harvest, reinforcing the connection between Amara's spirit and the life of the village. People began to notice that when they honored her memory, the rains were more generous, crops thrived, and illnesses among children decreased. The land itself seemed to respond to the reverence shown, as though affirming the enduring power of the nameless girl. As Amara's story spread, it transcended the confines of Leone. Traveling merchants, hunters, and neighboring villagers learned of the girl whose spirit could not be erased. They, too, began to share the tale with their children, emphasizing the importance of compassion and truthfulness, and warning against the destructive power of envy and fear. The story became a bridge linking communities and generations, as parents told their children that no matter how powerless one might feel in life, courage and kindness have a way of leaving a lasting mark. The children of Leone, now bearers of Amara's memory, took her story into their own hands quite literally. They created plays and songs, depicting her cleverness in solving problems, her gentle ways of aiding neighbors, and the injustice she had suffered. Even those too young to remember her life in the village firsthand could feel her presence through these performances. The energy of her spirit seemed to flow through their voices, the movement of their bodies, and the laughter that followed each enactment. Villagers attending these performances reported a peculiar warmth, a feeling that Amara herself was present among them, guiding their steps and teaching them through example. The influence of Amara's legacy extended beyond stories and performances. Villagers began adopting practices inspired by her life. People made a point of resolving disputes with fairness and empathy, mirroring the qualities she had embodied. They paid closer attention to the environment, recognizing the natural signs that had always communicated her presence. Streams were kept clear, trees were nurtured, and animals were treated with respect, acknowledging that Amara's essence was intertwined with every living thing in and around Leone. In this way, her influence became a practical guide for living, shaping both the moral and ecological balance of the village. Elders noted that as the village embraced these practices, the whispers of the ancestors grew clearer and more frequent. At dusk, when the children played near the river and on the hill where she had been buried, soft, melodic tones could be heard, carrying her name and the lessons of her life. These tones guided the children in their games, teaching them cooperation, cleverness, and the subtle ways of kindness. Even the adults found solace in listening, understanding that the land and the spirits were in constant communication, ensuring that justice and virtue were recognized and preserved. The ceremonies became annual events, tied to the seasons and agricultural cycles. Villagers would gather around the planted trees and near the riverbank, telling Amara's story to each new generation. Songs were composed in her honor, blending the natural sounds of the environment with human voices, creating a living harmony that reflected the ongoing connection between the village, Amara, and the ancestors. The elders taught that the name Amara was more than a word. It was a living symbol of resilience, compassion, and the enduring presence of those who are unjustly silenced but whose essence cannot be erased. Over time, the hill where she had been buried became a sacred place. Parents would bring their children to it not only to recount her story but to teach them respect for life, justice, and truth. The trees planted in her honor grew tall and strong, their roots entwined with the soil that had once hidden her. Streams diverted naturally toward the site, their gentle currents carrying the whispers of her name, reinforcing the idea that her spirit remained present, guiding and nurturing the village. Birds and animals too continued to honor her, their behavior subtly altered to interact peacefully with humans and each other, reflecting the harmony Amara had inspired even in life. Through these practices, Amara became a permanent symbol of moral and spiritual guidance. Her story was told not as a lament for what had been done to her but as an enduring testament to the power of courage, kindness, and resilience. The villagers learned to recognize that even those without recognition or status could leave an indelible mark, shaping the lives of generations to come. Her memory instilled in the hearts of children the knowledge that goodness, intelligence, and integrity could transcend mortality and human failings. By acknowledging Amara and enshrining her story in the rhythms of daily life, Leone transformed itself. Where fear and superstition once dominated, the virtues she embodied became the guiding principles of the village. Her story served as a reminder that injustice, once committed, could be rectified in the collective consciousness and that a single pure soul could influence the character of an entire community. In planting trees, tending streams, honoring animals, and recounting her tale, the villagers ensured that the nameless girl would never again be forgotten, that her legacy would continue to nurture hearts and minds, and that the whispers of the ancestors, speaking her true name, would echo through the generations, eternal and unbroken. The story of Amara, once a nameless girl buried unjustly on the outskirts of Leone, evolved over generations into a powerful testament of courage, resilience, and the enduring presence of truth. Though her life was cut short by fear and superstition, the whispers of the ancestors ensured that her essence would never fade. The hill where she had been buried became a sacred site, where the wind carried gentle murmurs of her name at dawn and dusk. Children, drawn by the soft, melodic tones, would run barefoot to the top of the hill, their hearts quickening as if sensing a presence unseen. They would play games, sing songs, and tell stories, always mentioning her name, Amara, which now held weight and meaning beyond mortal recognition. Elders recounted that the wind itself had become a messenger, carrying her voice to those willing to listen. As the mist rose from the fields in the early morning, it mingled with the murmured echoes of her name, forming an invisible thread connecting past and present, living and spirit. Even the skeptical adults, initially dismissive of such occurrences, found themselves pausing, feeling a quiet warmth, a subtle assurance that Amara's story was more than myth, it was a living guide. They realized that fear and superstition had failed to extinguish her essence, and that a heart unbowed by injustice could influence the village long after its owner was gone. The village of Leone itself transformed. Where children once played under the shadow of fear, they now carried the legacy of Amara's courage. Her name became synonymous with honesty, kindness, and ingenuity. Parents taught their children not merely to repeat her name but to embody the qualities she had demonstrated in life: cleverness balanced with compassion, courage tempered by empathy, and a sense of justice that sought harmony rather than vengeance. These lessons became ingrained in daily life, in games, chores, and community gatherings. Children would remind each other, "Remember Amara," when faced with a choice between selfishness and generosity, reinforcing the moral compass she had become. The natural world seemed to echo her presence. Flowers bloomed abundantly around the hill, following the patterns of the winds that carried her whispers. Streams shifted subtly toward the site of her burial, as if paying homage to the spirit that had been wronged yet remained unbroken. Birds sang melodies that seemed to mimic the tones of her name, and even the animals of the forest behaved with a gentle reverence near her sacred hill. The villagers came to understand that these were signs of ancestral approval, confirming that Amara's spirit guided the balance of the land and the community. Ceremonies were established to honor her memory. Families would gather around the planted trees and streams, leaving offerings such as water, seeds, or woven charms. Elders recounted her story aloud, teaching the younger generation to respect the legacy of the nameless girl. Each ritual, though simple, reinforced the moral and spiritual guidance she provided. Children learned the names of her virtues, creating chants and songs that intertwined her essence with the rhythm of village life. Even the uninitiated travelers who passed through Leone would hear the stories and the songs, leaving with the wisdom that goodness, once recognized, cannot be buried or silenced. Her story also became a guide for addressing injustice. When conflicts arose in Leone, elders reminded the village that fear and envy could not extinguish truth. They cited Amara's life and the persistence of her name as evidence that the righteous heart would endure, and that fairness, compassion, and courage should always prevail. Through these lessons, the village evolved from a place dominated by superstition and suspicion into a community grounded in ethical principles and respect for both people and nature. The nameless girl's legacy became the invisible hand that guided social behavior, ensuring that the village flourished in both moral and practical ways. Amara's presence inspired creativity among the children and the young. They composed songs, told tales, and created dances that celebrated her ingenuity and bravery. Even those born long after her death felt a connection to her through these cultural expressions. The sound of laughter, the rhythm of dance, and the harmonies of song all carried traces of her essence. Adults, too, found joy in participating, realizing that by celebrating her legacy, they reinforced the virtues that held their community together. The village discovered that memory, when nurtured with care, could become a powerful tool for collective growth and resilience. The hill, once a site of tragedy, became a place of pilgrimage. Families would take their children there at dawn and dusk, listening intently for the whispers of Amara's name. These moments of reflection became opportunities for teaching, not just her story but lessons on patience, observation, and moral integrity. Children learned to attune themselves to subtle signs, both in nature and in human behavior, understanding that attention, empathy, and awareness were critical for a harmonious life. Elders emphasized that Amara's name carried the weight of generations, and to ignore it was to ignore the guidance of the ancestors themselves. Through generations, her story grew richer. Songs evolved, incorporating the sounds of streams, birds, and wind. Plays were enacted by children, dramatizing her cleverness and bravery, her suffering, and the eventual recognition of her worth. The elders guided these performances, ensuring that the core of her story, the power of a pure heart and the intervention of the ancestors, remained intact. Even as details varied, the message was unwavering. Injustice cannot erase truth, and goodness leaves an indelible mark. The influence of Amara's legacy extended beyond moral teachings. Villagers learned to care for their environment in ways inspired by her story. Streams were kept clean, trees were nurtured, and animals were treated with respect. This ecological mindfulness became intertwined with the community's sense of justice and fairness. Every act of care for the land was a reflection of the care Amara had shown in her life, ensuring that her spirit was honored in practical, tangible ways. In time, Amara's story became a foundational part of Leone's identity. Children who had grown up hearing her name taught it to their own offspring, along with the virtues she embodied. The hill where she was buried, the trees planted in her honor, and the streams flowing near it formed a living monument to her existence. Her name became more than a memory, it became a guiding principle, a moral compass, and a bridge between the past and the future. The eternal whisper of Amara's name, carried by the wind, the streams, and the hearts of children, served as a perpetual reminder that a righteous soul, silenced by fear and injustice, could leave a legacy that shaped the lives of countless generations. It taught the villagers that truth and kindness, once sown, could never be eradicated, and that the ancestors themselves would ensure that those virtues remained alive. In every song sung, every tree nurtured, and every stream respected, Amara's presence endured, echoing endlessly through the generations. Thus, Leone became a village defined not by the mistakes of the past, but by the lessons of the nameless girl whose whispered name, Amara, continued to guide, protect, and inspire. The ancestors' promise was,